So my journey was very crazy. It like has a lot of digressing paths. I kept trying things. Some things worked out, some things didn't work out, and I made it to the interview stage at NID for their information and interface design courses. But I didn't kind of make it through, where we created fake horoscopes that would tell you things about your romantic life, right? So if you go on LinkedIn for any open product design role, right, it's marked as entry level, but then they say that, hey, we require like minimum of 3 to 5 years of experience, right? What the does entry level even mean in that sense? That's another big mistake I see a lot of people make, that I will only work at Cred, I will only work at Google, and then just be like pissed off with themselves forever because they don't get it. And
Yeah, I've made that mistake.
yeah, but the majority of product design work is more like plumbing, where you're like solving problems.
Hey everyone, welcome to Product Stories, the podcast that delves into the minds of product and design folks to talk about their stories, challenges, and work. My name is Kaushik, and in each episode, I talk to my guests about how they work, the process they follow, new tools, and the breakthroughs they have had in their career.
This week, our guest is Chandra. He's a product designer at Gojek. He previously worked in Obvious, which is one of the finest design studios in the country. We talk about his journey of becoming a designer, and we also talk about his time at Obvious and his experience in building POS. He talks about the reality of current design education as well as the design job market. He also talks about the mistakes that one can avoid when they're applying for design roles. This was a fun conversation with Chandra, and I hope you enjoy this episode as well. Hey Chandra, thank you so much for being here. It's kind of amazing to finally have you here. We started talking quite some time ago, and I'm super happy to have you on Product Stories. You're a well-known name in the Indian design ecosystem, so I'm super glad to have you here, and at the same time, really looking forward to talking to you more about a bunch of questions that I've planned out and stuff.
Thanks, Kaushik. I've been a big fan of the Product Stories podcast ever since you started it. I really enjoyed a lot of your episodes, and I'm really excited that I'm here too. And yeah, let's get started.
Yeah, I mean, like before we start, like for some of the folks that don't
Yeah.
know you yet, I
Yeah.
would like you to give probably like a short intro about you, kind of how you started, and what you do now, and stuff.
Sure. So I'm Chandra. I'm a product designer. I was until very recently based out of Pondicherry, but I'm in Bangalore now. I work at an Indonesian on demand services startup called Gojek, and they're kind of a super app for Indonesia, where they provide transportation services, food delivery, grocery delivery, package, package sending, like all payments, all kinds of stuff. So, as a product designer, I work in a merchant growth and monetization team. So, our food delivery app has a lot of small enterprise partners and eateries and restaurants who sell on our platform. And my job is, and the job of the team I'm part of, is to help them grow their business and reach new customers. So I primarily work on the Gojek consumer application, and work with our merchants and work with our business teams to figure out new ways in which merchants can reach new customers, and how those new features and sub products would behave. Before Gojek, so I've been at Gojek for about a year and a half. But before that, I was at a product design studio called Obvious, which is one of India's leading product design studios, and they've worked with a lot of Indian startups. I was a product designer, and I was working in their in-house B2B SaaS product called Pause, which was helping to automate a lot of repetitive HR processes. And I hold a master's degree in design from Srishti, and integrated bachelor's and master's in economics and public policy from IIT Madras.
Got it. So, you've kind of had a very interesting journey, right? So,
Yeah,
you're in Gojek right now. Before, like as you mentioned, you were an obvious. But kind of where you started off was as like a copywriter,
hmm,
and how did that journey happen? Like, going from writing um, to
sure,
being a designer. So, what was that journey like?
sure. So my journey was very crazy. It like has a lot of digressing paths. I kept trying things. Some things worked out, some things didn't work out, and I just committed to what actually worked out. So I was always interested in design. I was always kind of, so all these designers have the same origin story, right? You're that kid who like painted a lot or drew a lot in school, and then you go to college, and then you get a pirated version of Photoshop, and then you're making like posters and stuff for different college fests and college clubs and all of that, right? And that was the same for me. I was always interested in a career in arts and the media. And when I was doing my undergraduation degree, I got the chance to. I was very at that time. I was very interested in writing, and I got the chance to intern at some ad agencies when I was in my undergrad uh, college, right? But then I realized that that's not really what I was interested in. The skill set is not that different from design in a lot of ways, right? Like in a sense, you're trying to tie like a consumer's need to the messaging that the ad gives them to convince them to take an action or buy something. But then so I worked in some ad agencies, and I worked on a bunch of projects. So if you remember, there used to be a Mintra competitor called Jabong which collapsed. uh,
Yeah,
yeah, so
yeah, yeah.
that was one
I
of the
think they
very.
were owned by Amazon.
Yeah, it was. I think it was owned by Rocket
Or
Internet. So there's this startup studio in Germany
okay.
that makes that makes like startup copies of say different things like Amazon and so on, and then they end up getting acquired. That's their exit strategy. So Jabong was one
Hmm.
such thing. It was basically a Mintra clone, and I was in. So that was one of the first projects I worked on as a copywriter. And so one of the ads I worked on ended up in like the front page of the Hindustan Times, right? And I think both and it's the same as a designer. Like there's a pleasure in getting your work shipped. Similarly, there's a pleasure in seeing the work
Yeah.
that you do, like go out into mass production and many people see it. So, but yeah, I was working in different ad agencies, and for a lot of reasons, I realized it wasn't something that was for me, right? And it was not work that I found very fulfilling or that I was like extremely good at. So, but but yeah, another very fun one. If you remember this, do you remember this app called Woo? It was basically like another clone of Tinder or Bumble in back in like 2014, 2015,
Yeah.
and they're trying to launch in India, right? So we did like a Facebook ad campaign for them, this agency I was working for, where we created fake horoscopes that would tell you things about your romantic life. Like for example, so we'd show a picture of like a cat looking at the camera, and we'll say that hey, a stranger will look at you with warmth and affection. Or we'll put like a or we put a picture of like a banana peel, and he said somebody will sweep you off your feet. Or we put a picture of like an electric socket and said like today sparks will fly. Like we used to make these really shitty puns, and we made that into like a Facebook ad campaign, and I was very proud of that. So but yeah, it was fun, but I think in the end I felt like there was more that I could do, right? I realized that I didn't want to just be in the copywriting side of things. So I ended up so and this is when I was still in college. Around my final year of college, one of my professors, he ran a consulting company on campus, and I bullied basically. So what I did, so I like to tell people I bullied him into giving me a job, but I just used to go to his office every day and say, "Sir, this work you're doing is really interesting. I'd love to be a part of it. I'd love to be a part of it." Until he gave up and made me an intern there. So I was doing a bunch of essentially what they do was they'd consult with various builders, they'd consult with the Chennai government on stuff like how do you make your buildings more climate resilient, how do you make your city more, so in case there's like mass flooding, what can you do to improve it or make it better, how do we increase renewable energy consumption. So that was my first exposure to UX research in a way. So we were working on a project for Department of Science and Technology in Sri Perumbudur, which is a suburb of Chennai, where they were basically trying to see how can we make Tamil Nadu have more renewable energy. So as an intern, a lot of my job was basically I'd travel to I'd travel to that city. I'd go around houses. I'd ask them, stuff like what is the energy consumption, how many fans do you have, how many lights do you have, what all appliances do you have, right? And based on that, we'd say that okay, here's what the residential electricity consumption looks like today. In the future, it's going to look like this. Therefore, this is the energy consumption that's going to happen in the future. um, and that was my first exposure to UX research, right? Talking to people, understanding their current situation, understanding pain points and problems that they had. And my professor had also brought in brought in some guest faculty from Srishti, which is a design college in Bangalore, to give a lecture on design research and design thinking methods and processes. And that was my first exposure to this field. And I realized, hey, there's this thing I enjoy doing as a hobby, but it turns out that it's actually an entire field. There's this entire set of processes and methods that exist, and that's when I started becoming seriously interested in design. So I continued working at my professor's company. I was an intern, so I was basically doing everything, right? Like I was fetching coffee, I was like making sure the projector worked in meetings, but I was also doing stuff like helping create reports, helping create presentations that they'd make to various clients, and finally, um, and then I kept getting more and more interested in design, and I started doing some basic freelance stuff for different clients while I was still in college, but that was mostly like visual design, right? And I became, and then I realized that design is something I'd really like to do. It's something I'd see myself doing like very seriously. And for my final project in my undergraduation, I was looking at the disaster management response of the Chennai Municipal Corporation to a recent cyclone. And then I proposed like a basic UI that they can use to track uh, where are where exactly badly hit areas are, and that it would, so then basically people would go to those badly hit areas and they'd basically send a response, and it would appear on a map. It would say that this area is badly affected, please send repairs here. And I created this UI, and then I kind of user tested it, and I proposed it to the and I showed it to some people in that Chennai government as well, and it got a fairly interesting response, but like I couldn't really get the chance to build more on it. And that was my first exposure to like UI design. Of course, like it was like there's still a lot I didn't know. And like compared to now, like I was basically just designing out of my ass, right? Like I was just thinking it'll be nice if this is there in the screen, let's just put it there. I was not really following any process. But I also did a lot of UX research to understand how the Chennai government process works during disaster situations, how they communicate with each other, um, what exactly were the steps they took when a certain cyclone happened, how did they anticipate things. So that was again more exposure to UX research for me, and I realized I really liked doing that. So then I thought, okay, if this is how it's going to be, I'd like to study design further. So I applied to NID and IIT Bombay straight out of undergrad while I was in my final year, and I made it to the interview stage at NID for their information and interface design courses, but I didn't kind of make it through. And so NID's process is very crazy, right? Like you've got multiple rounds of entrance exams, then you've got like you have to go to Bangalore and you have to be on site where they give you like a physical assignment to do, then you have like rounds of interviews. So like an entire week just went in that, and then I just got very cheesed off afterwards. I'm like, I don't want to go through this again, I don't like it. So then I joined a market research firm. So I'd gotten placed in this market research firm called Kantar, which basically was a data analytics and insights firm, and I was working in their R&D team in Calcutta, and I was there for about a year. And fortunately or unfortunately, I got the chance to work on some very interesting software products that they were building, right? So again, I got some exposure to UI UX there, even though I was not the person designing it. I was more of like a project manager. And one of the most interesting things I worked on. So essentially, the issue with a lot of market research is that currently the way it's done, they do surveys, they go do focus groups with consumers, right? And they are basically asking them, "Will you buy this?" And it's very hard to get objective information that way. So they were trying to figure out. And at that time, a lot of these market research firms were getting their butt kicked by like Facebook, Google, because they had like behavioral data, right? So they know that okay, people navigate to this keyword. This is how people interact with product pages. These are the queries that people have. So then what they were trying to do was they created a fake crowdfunding website where they put their clients product concepts, and they'd get traffic to it, and they'd analyze the traffic and see okay, which concept is getting the best response, which is getting like most comments, which is like people are trying to pledge money to it. Like you couldn't actually pledge money to it, but we measure like if you clicked on that button. And I realized that this is super interesting stuff and I'd like to do more of it. Now, then what happened was in 2018, the CEO of our company, he was a British guy. And he basically punched his name was Sir Martin Sorrell. And he was basically misusing the company money, and he also like punched his driver. And it was like a very big scandal in the company, and he got fired. and the new CEO decided to sell the division I was working for. So then I saw this news coming. I realized, oh God, this is not great. Things are going to be like really, really bad. And then I started planning to quit, right? And but then like I was thinking, what do I do, right? I have this set of skills of data analysis and project management, but like I don't want to keep doing the same kind of job. I was very interested in design in college, and it's something I'd still like to do, and it's something I'd still like to stick to. So I started looking at design courses in India and abroad. So, um, so in India, uh, I again found Srishti. They had done that project like a few years back that my professor had conducted, right? That design thinking workshop. So I reached out to them. They put me in touch with one of the people who runs their UX and human computer interaction course, and it seemed interesting to me. So I decided to apply, and they had a fairly sane process as compared to something like NID or IIT Bombay. So they had an entrance exam which I could skip, I think, because I'd already written like the GMAT or something like that. Then they also and I think I also had like my still had my NID and seed results from that previous year. Then they had like a portfolio presentation, and they had like a small design assignment, and I presented all of that, and they said, sure, you can come join us. So I joined Sishti in Bangalore, and I came there, and I was really immersed into design. I was really understand. There's so much I didn't know about what design was, how it worked, because until that point I was self-taught, right? And I was basically just googling stuff and just copy pasting it at that point. Or I was just doing things that felt and looked good to me, but without any underlying rationale or theory as to why I was doing that. Then I was then while I was at Srishti in my first year, I was on Twitter and I came across this Rahul Gonsalves, he was the founder of Uncommon. Now it's called Obvious. And I pinged him and said, "Hey, I'd like to do an internship with you." So I went, visited their office. It's this beautiful bungalow in behind that used to be behind Arbor Brew Pub in South Bangalore. And I visited them, and I interned with them once, and then I think it was a good fit, so I kept interning with them again and again. I interned with them like three times. Then I joined them full time in 2020 as a product designer, and and I was really excited because like Obvious is a fantastic company, and but I wasn't. But then when I joined, so primarily Obvious is like a services company, right? As a they work for different startups as basically a kind of on-demand product and design team. And now in 2020, they decided they wanted to try following more of a base camp type model, where they were wanted to build their own software and own products in addition to their consulting services. So I joined that team, and they started to build a product called Pause, which was essentially automating a lot of repetitive HR processes, especially around applying for leave, applying for time off, communicating to people that there was time off. And I helped work on some of that product, and I did a lot of UX research for it as well. And but what I started volunteering for was a lot of marketing and sales and customer support stuff, which nobody else was really doing, and that basically became most of my job. And that's what I did there for nearly a year. So normally, in most B2B SaaS websites, like on the bottom right corner, there's like a little chat icon, and you tap on that, right? And it says, "Hello, this is like Rob from Intercom. How can I help you today?" Like that was me. That was mostly my job, right? And so it turns out that when it comes to product development, there's a lot of like less glamorous stuff that you need to do in order to keep the lights on, right? Stuff like responding to customer complaints about bugs. Stuff like, for example, you get a large enterprise customer, somebody has to onboard them, somebody has to port over their data, somebody has to make sure that their somebody has to conduct the demos for the entire company when they're getting on board, right? So like somebody has to write the product manual, somebody has to so somebody has to keep posting in like LinkedIn, Reddit, Twitter, all of those things. So like I ended up doing a lot of that. It was a lot of fun. I learned a lot about like the kind of ops things you need to do in order to keep a company or product running, right? But then I felt like this is not something I wanted to do like forever. And I figured that, hey, you know what, I've studied design, I've done my masters in design, and I spent 2 years of my life doing that. And I'd like to keep working in design at least for a little while longer. So I started. So around that time, the Gojek opportunity presented itself, and I interviewed there, and I joined the team in September of 2021, and I've been there ever since. So yeah, I know my journey is completely crazy. I had to spend a lot of time talking about it, but yeah,
Yeah, man. I mean, that's quite a journey.
yeah,
Like, uh, lots of ups and downs, but
oh,
like,
absolutely.
I'm I'm glad you are at a place that you
Mm,
enjoy working in and you're happy at the same
thank you.
time. Um, kind of like I know we kind of started talking about like how you started with like writing and
Yeah,
copywriting and stuff. Um, and how it kind of led you to becoming a designer
yeah,
and everything, right? Like, um, probably like the question that I have is like, what influence does like having a skill as like knowing how to write or like a background in
yeah.
writing, how does that help you like with the kind of designer you are? Um,
Sure.
uh, yeah,
Well, it's helped me very much, but but the way in which I see writing has helped me is that, so I think writing serves two functions, right? One, that it helps communicate information to a reader, and it helps the writer themselves form their thoughts better. It forces clarity. So when you have something written down on paper, like, it's easy to see like what is bullshit, what logic doesn't work, what chain of thought is like not really sound, right? So writing forces you to be very clear about what you're communicating and to whom. So because of that, and I've seen there can be lots of possible miscommunications as a designer, right? Because you're working with so many different stakeholders. Especially in like very large companies, each of them want different things and expect different things from you. uh, and as a designer, you have to basically juggle a lot of that, right? So my writing skills kind of helped me stay on top of things. Say, let's say I'm working on a complex project, there are multiple stakeholders, there are multiple like milestones, there's a lot of stuff going on, like, writing short memos, summarizing meetings, key action items, stuff like that, right? It's basically like an operating system. It becomes like an operating system for like making sure everybody's on the same page, that like no miscommunication ends up happening, that you end up knowing how to summarize what's the most important thing. You end up knowing how to write things in a way that, you know there's no ambiguity, everybody clearly understands what you're trying to say, right? And it just becomes like almost a superpower as a designer, right? So for example, if I'm annotating a design, or I'm working on a design and the developers have to pick it up afterwards, right? Oftentimes, especially in like very large, there are all kinds of possible edge cases, there are all kinds of uh, behaviors, all kinds of stuff that you as a designer have to specify, right, or figure out. And writing kind of helps you do that. Writing helps you be very clear and leave no room for ambiguity in how you want the design vision you're working on to be translated into the software or product that you're building. And so that's one rule. So writing helps in communication, writing helps in communicating, in making sure projects keep going well. Writing helps in documentation, because see, as a designer, right, a lot of the reasoning, a lot of this a lot so when you're designing something, a lot of your reasoning, that hey, this is the layout I've chosen, this is the user journey I've chosen, here's why I've made things this way, a lot of it is currently in your head, right? And it's sometimes difficult to make that to take that thing out of your head and put it onto some place where other people can understand why you thought this way. Because one issue I've seen is like designers, they often like sure, present the designs, but there's no context, right? And people get confused. They're like, hey, why is it like this? Why you done it this way? And as a writer, like, it kind of, if you write a lot, you end up being very disciplined about how you think, about the logic that you follow, and that ends up showing in the design as well, right? So I'm able to communicate that, hey, I've made this XYZ design decision for ABC reason. Here are the other options I've explored. Here's why I think this is the best. And that just helps so much in terms of reducing clarity, in terms of improving clarity, in terms of being more effective as an operator. And uh, and I'm much more of a written word person than I'm as a spoken word person, right? Because like in my head, like I have so many thoughts whirring around all at once. Like I'm thinking about multiple things. I keep going into different trains of thought. And especially even in spoken word, you can see now, like I digress a lot in the podcast. I say something, then I stop, and then I get back to it again. But as a writer, like, you can't do that, right? You have to clearly establish a relationship between every point you're making. So so yeah.
Great, man. I I think I I don't think anyone has ever explained writing to me that way,
Yeah,
uh, in such a detailed manner, and like the difference, the clear difference, right, between like speaking and writing.
yeah.
Uh, yeah, I mean that was
Glad you like
interesting.
it.
Uh, yeah, coming to one of the other points from like what you talked about, which was like how you how you told about like hey, you found out about obvious, and then like you kept interning with obvious, and you
Yeah,
kind of ended up joining them full time. Um, now, Obvious, as you mentioned, is one of the finest design studios in the country. So I kind of want to know more about like Obvious,
sure.
what kind of practices they follow, and like what makes Obvious so good.
Sure. I can't speak for Obvious as a whole. As a designer, as an intern, then as a junior designer, there I only experienced like a small amount of a small fraction of things. But I can talk about what I personally found helpful or helped me grow a lot, right? So
Yeah, purely from your
sure.
experience.
So one was that Obvious had a very strong writing and documentation culture. So they became slightly Twitter famous for what they call their design playbook, right? So essentially, what they did was all their processes, all the practices that they used to like run a project, how they did user research, how they went about design, the modified design sprint process they were following. They basically put it all in like a wiki document and made it online for anybody to follow, right? And I think that's how a lot of people discovered it in the first place. And because of that, so Obvious had a very very strong process, and they had a very strong culture of documenting things that worked well, and that's what I really really enjoyed, right? So when you're so as an intern, a lot of the learning you get comes, so as an intern, like, you don't have an experience of like professional norms or how workplaces should work, right? Like, that's one of the reasons you're doing an internship. And Obvious had a lot of this data. Obvious had a lot of their previous project files, their previous project presentations, all their um, they talk a lot about all their case studies, all their documentation. It was there, and you could read it, and you could see how they think, you could see how they design things, you could see how their thought process was, you could see how their craft process by looking at previous design files and seeing how they went about things. And that was like super valuable, right? And the second thing that Obvious did really well was elevating the voices of the people who worked there. So they were really encouraging people to build their personal brands, to write blog posts, to write blog articles, to share things, to share projects, like in the Figma community. And they had a very strong internal critique culture where people would like give really honest and unbiased feedback on different projects that people were working on. And that was just fantastic, right? Because Obvious also had a very very strong visual and craft sensibility. They had a lot of domain expertise, especially on mobile apps, because they started as a Android and mobile development studio, right? And they worked with a lot of really path breaking mobile apps like Ola, Dunzo, Swiggy. So they had just like a so there's just this huge amount of expertise they had, that they were like very happy to share with people who worked there. And so as and like in a lot, and I was used to like a very different work culture where like people hoard information, they don't share things with each other. And Obvious is open environment, and the way in which they and the way open way spirit in which they gave critique and feedback was very very new to me. And it really made an impact on me, right? That, hey, you know what, so I was that the that the real alpha comes from helping other people and sharing information, not hoarding it or just keeping it all to yourself. That was the biggest learning that I had, right? And people just went out of their way to help you. So one of my colleagues, Vikalp, right, on like on my first day as an intern there, he gave me like an entire tutorial on Figma, that hey, this is how it works, here's how it's different from Sketch, here's what you need to get used to. And like he just did it because like he's a generous person, right? They attracted like really generous people who'd share their expertise and knowledge with each other. And that was just really something that was unusual to me, and I think that's something that's unusual in the industry. Yeah.
Interesting. Yeah, I mean, like, I think that's something you feel when you talk to Vikram for the first time
Yeah.
also.
Oh, he's amazing. Yeah.
That he's, yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, like, I did meet him when I met you for the first
Yeah.
time itself. Uh, but yeah, kind of like moving on, and kind of like how I discovered you, right? It was like because of how actively, like, you're present
Yeah.
across social medias, and mostly Twitter.
Yeah.
And usually you have, like, quite a few opinions on a bunch of things.
Yeah.
So, and I've seen you write on a few topics, like, the way design education is working at the moment, and the way it designs job scenarios at the moment, right? So I thought, like, I'll talk to you a bit more about that, and kind of what you think about the current scenario is.
Okay. Um, do you want? All right. So I just wanted to ask: is this like a family-friendly podcast? Because I'm going to start swearing a lot, and like, how hot takes do you? How much hot do you want my takes to be? Right. Um.
uh, I mean, like, you can absolutely swear, that's not a
Oh, great.
problem at all. The only thing is, like, yeah, I think just go for it, man. We'll see post
Sure.
while editing.
I think that. I think the jobs. I think the Indian design scene is great in the sense that you've got a lot of people who are really sharing their information and knowledge with each other and building things and talking about it, right? But at the same time, it's also, the way I see it, it's a very big bubble. A lot of designers are simply not on Twitter, but at the same time, I see companies, recruiters over index on people with popular social media followings, right? They over index on and there's also this focus on content creation, becoming a thought leader, kind of running your own boot camp or mentorship. I think that design as a profession, a lot of it is very subjective, and a lot of it is very hard to really evaluate without context, or if you're not a designer. Because of that, a lot of people get away with a ton of bullshit. So but something like coders, for example, right? Like, you can objectively evaluate if someone's code is good, right? You can objectively say that okay, this code runs, this code meets uh, the outcomes that it wants. But like product management, design are fuzzier. So you may have seen there are a lot of cohort based courses that emerge saying that hey, you'll will get your product management or design job in 12 weeks. Or you have all these thought leaders and influencers who come up and say that hey, I'm going to be a mentor, I'll review your portfolio, I'll give you this feedback, right? And I'm like, and I think that in this current job scenario, we pay a lot of attention to people who are loud, people who say things for the sake of saying things, as opposed to people who are actually, doing the work and staying humble and putting their head down. A lot of the best designers, even at my team in Gojek, right? So one of the senior designers I work with, so she's fantastic, and she's not on any social media platform at all. Okay, she's just quietly doing her job, kicking ass, and going home. But unfortunately, as a profession, we seem to confuse being loud on social media, being creating content. We just as we confuse that for being good at the job that you currently do. And because of that, I think it creates a lot of skewed incentives for for people, right? I see like people who are just out of college with like 1 or 2 years of experience, and they're spending all their time, like, sure, you can make YouTube videos, sure you can, but I see some of the stuff they say, right? They make like all kinds of claims about design, they're doing all kinds of hot takes and stuff. And I'm like, are you listen, like, you don't know anything, you have no experience, how can you say this? And it just really freaks me out. And at the same time, um, the design community in India is still very, very small, and there are very few senior leadership people, right? And the thing is, I think most designers don't want to be like the only designer, or like in a very small team in so most people end up applying to the same 5, 10, 15 companies, right, which have large design teams and better hiring and growth processes. And because of that, what ends up happening is that it ends up being a vicious circle, right? So if every designer who's joining the workforce wants to work with the same few companies, at the same time there's so many other companies who are starved for design talent, and they're like, hey, we're unable to hire designers, we're unable to find people who want to join us. But and at the same time, sometimes they have like very, very unrealistic expectations that, hey, we want somebody with 5 years of experience working in this domain. But like, why would this person want to work for you, right? um the biggest challenge is that designers generally go to where other designers are, because they see that as a proxy for their work is going to be valued, and they're going to get the chance to work on interesting things and grow. But because of that, companies which are trying to build a design team from scratch have the problem that or designers working at less well-known companies have this problem that, hey, we're unable to get people to work with us, and we're unable to, or if you want to change your job after working at a less well-known company, you're unable to get people to take you seriously, because we are again fixating on like brand names and resumes, right? Like, so I was talking to some recruiter and some hiring friends, right? And for designers, they look at designers either from some colleges or from schools or from certain companies that have large design teams. That, hey, I'm going to hire this ex razor pay person, I'm going to hire this ex cred person, and that and I feel that that's the biggest problem in our design scene, where we index more on the brand name, we index more on the on whatever social media following a person has. We index more on what school or college they went to, as opposed to the proof of work and the proof that they can deliver the work that they're able to give. And uh, and the other issue is that a lot of design education is very, very, very detached from the reality of working in an actual company. So I think Nikhil Yadav, he'd made a big thread about a year or two back. So I think GrowthX or Growth School, one of those startups, had made an Instagram ad saying that, oh, UI design is the hottest thing, it's most in demand. Join now, like sign up now. And he got very upset over it, and he posted a day in his life. This was back when he worked at Gojek, and he was talking about that, hey, a lot UI design is not this very sexy or glamorous role. A lot of my job is coordinating, getting in meetings with people, figuring out things, solving problems, right? And and like, I really resonated a lot with it, because I think that I think that we in social media tend to glamorize even the design profession as like artists or someone who's amazingly creative, right? But the majority of product design work is more like plumbing, where you're like solving problems, you're working and maintaining things. So like, as a designer, right, like I can tell you, last week, um, I'm working with a front end developer on like a legacy code base, and we wanted to run some experiments on top of that. And we can't really make a lot of dramatic changes to our UI. So like, we're just figuring out, okay, what is this? How does it work? How can we tweak this or not? So a lot of it is very like, you're really in the weeds. You're really figuring out things, and it's not like, you're making some really sexy animation or like making some really beautiful looking micro interaction, right? Like, that's like, I could do like, that's sometimes part of my work, but most of my work is working with tech and product to like figure out, okay, given these constraints, what can we do and what can we work on. And it's hard to like create a sexy dribble shot out of that. It's hard to like make like a sexy Twitter animated mock-up out of that, right? And uh, and I think this is true for the vast majority of designers, right? Like, if you're going to be working on like a B2B banking application, or you're going to be working on or something like that, right? You're using your design skills to solve like complex interaction or UX problems. This is not something that your average designer on Twitter is going to be like, upvote or like find make viral or something like that, right? Like, as like a community, we're chasing like stuff that is that looks pretty, stuff that's like attention grabbing, but that's not necessarily the stuff that adds the most value. Like as a designer, okay, I'm going to tell you one thing. Like as a designer, my job in Gojek, right? One of the highest value things I ever did was essentially just working on like so, and I was essentially just working on this document that our business team was going to use. So essentially, for a third party sponsored content, it turns out that there's a bunch of legal stuff we need to follow, right? Stuff like, for example, you can't really show tobacco or alcohol in ads. You can't really show violence or firearms in ads, right? So what I did was I just put together a document that said, hey, to provide a good user experience to our users, let's ensure that our ad visuals don't contain A, B, C, D content. And like it's like that outcome, like the output looks like just that is just a document, right? It's just like, hey, this is boring, like, but the outcome of that document was like drove a lot of business value and like protected the user experience for like millions of our users. And like I think a lot of product design work is like this, right? It's valuable, it's stuff that is generates tremendous value for the companies and organizations that we work for, but it gets overlooked or ignored because it's not what we as an industry think is sexy. And that just really freaks me out, right? Because it feels like and I hate talking about dribble, but it feels like and designers are mimetic creatures, right? We want to copy what others do or see as successful. So everybody starts creating dribble shots, everybody starts creating like overly stylized stylized things. And it, even though they don't really have to, or they get upset, or like I was speaking to other designers, they're like, hey, I work in this B2B company, it's like doing well, it's profitable. So I'm like, oh, that's fantastic, then what's your problem? And they're like, oh, the work is boring, all I do is make dashboards. So I'm like, what do you want to do? We're like, oh, I want to make sexy mobile apps. I'm like, great if you want to make sexy mobile apps, but you already got a good thing going, right? Like you're unhappy for like the stupidest possible reason. Like right now, especially in this environment, like where companies are laying off people, where there's like fears of a recession, you've got like a great job, and the only reason you're upset is because like like as part of your, because like you can't really show off the work you're doing. Like come on, like you can do side projects, you can do your own thing, right? And I think the broader pernicious issue is that a lot of people come into design and they just make it all about themselves, right? They're like, design is my entire identity. They don't really separate themselves from their work. They don't really say that, hey, the thing I'm working on is just a thing I'm working on, and it's not going to be representative of me as a person. And because they're unable to do this, you end up with these insane situations. Sorry, I just went on a complete rant there.
No, not a problem. Um,
Yeah.
yeah, I mean, like I know, like you have talked about this a bunch of times. You have written threads about this, but another thing that you have also kind of like keep talking about is like these practices which like
Yeah.
companies follow, especially when it comes to hiring, which is like
Oh, yeah.
somewhat predatory. Um, so kind of want to talk about that as well.
Yeah, I'd love to talk about it. So you've got predatory hiring. So one of the stupidest things, right? So if you go on LinkedIn for any open product design role, right, it's marked as entry level, but then they say that, hey, we require like minimum of 3 to 5 years of experience, right? What the does entry level even mean in that sense? Um, or stuff like, for example, some large companies, right, only hire freshers from certain colleges. So like for example, for example, if you're a fresher from like a non-name brand college, it's going to be much harder to go into some of those companies. Um, so if you look at a lot of the college placements for something like NID, IIT Bombay, right, IIT Guwahati, and you try, and like they only hire from those particular colleges, right? I'm not saying it's predatory, but like it makes sense for them to do that. But what ends up happening is that, and these are fantastic opportunities, right? But uh, um, the vast majority of fresher designers are not going to be part of those colleges, right? And you're losing out on a lot of talent by doing it this way. Similarly, another one is another issue with the hiring practices. So it's a fact that you've designers are like, the most designers are the less paid ones in most companies, right? So you've got the product triad, you've got the product manager, you've got the engineering manager, and you've got the designer, right? And that's generally how the product squad thing is organized. And the designer is the one where it's often harder to argue for higher salaries on par with what the developers and product managers are getting, right? Even though the design contribution is also still very crucial. um, or for example, and the other issue is that, and there are a bunch of like really shitty processes which are, I think, not really specific to design per se, stuff like tying the compensation that you'd get to your previously drawn CTC, right? So actually what this does is this really over a lot of people who are trying to migrate from service companies to product companies. Because for example, you're working at something like and you're making like 4.5 lakhs a year, right, as a UI designer. And let's say you want to join some product company, and so what they do is they don't really pay you based on what they pay the others, right? They'll say that, hey, we don't really offer hikes, so we'll just give you like a 30-40% hike, right? So, and other companies keep doing this, and you're basically at a disadvantage throughout your career, right? um, but now I think it's changing. So some companies have their own internal bands, and they just stick to that instead of offering a hike of a percentage over what the employee is previously making. But it's still it's still a big problem, right? I'd made a thread about a friend who'd interviewed at a food delivery company, and the HR had basically said that we'll offer you lakhs per annum, but if you don't disclose your current CTC, we'll give you X minus 2 lakhs per annum, which is again like really stupid. And the uh, I think as a designer, what I'm very interested to see is that these HR practices, these recruitment practices, even though it like creates a bad experience for me as a candidate, a lot of these companies and a lot of these design teams don't really seem to do anything about it, right? And I'm surprised as to why, and I don't understand why. Maybe I don't have context. Maybe they're trying to change it internally, but it didn't change. I don't know. But like the more I hear these stories, the more I'm amazed that, hey, this company has some design leaders who tweet a lot on Twitter, who like very well respected. How can things be so bad at this company? Like that just doesn't make sense to me. Then I realized it's also an organizational thing, right? Like design is just seen as a function, and HR is seen as a separate thing. And like as a design manager, you don't have input over how the hiring process works for you. I don't know, but like it was just very disillusioning for me, right? That and I used to think, hey, if this company is employing this amazing person, that means the rest of the company is amazing. But turns out no. And more than that, but those are mostly just hiring practices, right? And another big issue is that, and this is one thing that people most really don't follow, right, is the NDAs, and non-disclosure agreements. So as an employee, like as a designer, you want proof of work that someone's done, right? But like it's very difficult to show that if you're like bound by an NDA. Like how do you go about talking about what you can do if you're not allowed to show it, right? So what a lot of designers do is, for example, they take their NDA work, they just like put it behind a password protected thing in their portfolio. But like that still doesn't really work, right? And like as a designer, you can't really go to your manager and say, hey, I'm looking to leave, is it okay for me to put this in my portfolio? Because then the manager will know that this guy's looking to leave, let's just fire this guy, right? And I think that I get that there can be proprietary information, but I think a lot of companies don't really realize the damage they're doing to employees' careers by having these NDAs, right? And people just bypass them anyway, and they bypass it in a way that can put them at risk later. And and that's just a red flag for me, man. Um, it's just that as a designer, right? Like you've done this work, and how this current system works is that you have to show this proof of work and these case studies. But how do you do that if you're not allowed to, right? And that's just one thing I think about a lot. And like and because a lot of the work that happens in design, especially in large companies, isn't just design, right? It's stuff like is understanding how the design system works. It's stuff like understanding the technical and business constraints. A lot of it is like creating lots of small experiments, prototyping, a lot of stuff that this classic case study format really doesn't account for. And the classic and most of these case study formats think that, hey, you know what, you're owning like a feature end to end with everything: research, user testing, uh, various iterations of design, and boom, you have like a very nice output at the end, right? But most design projects, especially in the real world, are a lot messier. And like, for example, like, you're working with a product manager, we're like, hey, we want to run an experiment this quarter, let's just mock up some designs for it. And then you mock it up, and then like you don't get the exact data back until like until a while later, and then maybe that part of the product gets shelved, right? Like, the actual process of product development is a lot more messier and complex. And I think that um and I think that most, and I don't really see that the way, and I look at portfolios, right? I spend a lot of time looking at portfolios and case studies of other people, and they basically artificially create this clarity. They think that things were much more straightforward and linear than they actually were. And what ends up happening is that, like, a lot of the skill set of the designer is how you navigate this complexity or chaos, right? That, hey, um, if the technical architect, so I'll give you an example of a of a feature I was working on in our Gojek consumer app. Okay, essentially, we wanted to put something in the Gojek homepage, but the Gojek homepage so like I spent a lot of time doing some research, designing something, user testing it. But then, like, the Gojek homepage technical architecture couldn't accommodate our feature due to like this backend problem of how often the data would update on the backend, and this feature would update more than like the normal backend response could accommodate, and therefore it just wouldn't work. So then, like, I had to shelve it all and start from scratch. And like, like, I was just very pissed off. But then, like, I learned a valuable lesson about, say, about, for example, like, I could have avoided this altogether if I'd gone to those homepage tech team in the first place and said, hey, can you tell me how this thing works? Here's my proposed feature, does this work or not, right? So like, like, most design projects are complex. You make mistakes, you backtrack a lot, you try things, some things don't work, some things work. And ultimately you just launch something, and then you make changes to it as you go along, right? but uh, but um, but like, that's how a lot of real world design is. But that's not reflected in how people talk about the design work that they do. It's not reflected in how it's not reflect or for example, I'll give you another example of a really messy project I worked on. So imagine you're a small merchant, right? Imagine you're like Rameshwaram Idli and you're selling on Swiggy, right? And you want to reach people near you, and you want to inform them that, hey, I've got this, that I exist, I've got this new discount, I've got this new promotion, I've opened a new store in a vicinity. Come, uh, come order from me. And we were doing this as banners inside our Gojek food app, right? So imagine like a small next billion user type merchant using a smartphone. They take a picture of their food. It was like an internal Canva where they could like select a banner and they could like launch it and it could work, right? So when we did the experiment, like we select purposefully selected merchant partners. We created like very beautiful content and we launched it, and the uh, experiment with the banners was a big success. But so then our business team like saw dollar signs in their eyes and they decided to scale it up, right? Then what happened was that this experiment didn't work when it was scaled to the whole of Indonesia, because a lot of the merchants had like really bad quality cameras, and the photos they took were, like, bad quality, and it wasn't giving us the user experience that we wanted, right? And that's the kind of crazy, um, and that's the kind of crazy thing you couldn't have anticipated, right? And then we had to make some changes to how our banners worked, and we had to experiment with new templates. But like, that's how it works. Like, you try something, it works until it doesn't work, and then like you just go ahead and do it again, right? It's messy, it's complex, it's ambiguous. And but what a lot of but in my experience of interviewing at companies in the case study round, what they want is that, hey, I had this problem, I solved it, here's the result, tada. They seem to want some cleaned up, they want to see some cleaned up, uncomplicated thing that they're able to understand. And I think that it's doing a disservice to designers and the work that they actually do. Because real design work is messy, but real design work is ambiguous. Real design work is, like, sometimes you fail, sometimes it just doesn't work, some things don't work out, and those learnings from that are valuable. But we seem to just want success, we seem to just want things in a particular template, or things to look a particular way. And I think because of that, and that's another way in which I believe those hiring processes are really broken. Yeah. So I just went on another
Interesting,
rant there.
man. That's
I've got so many more of these. So
I mean, like, no problem at all.
yeah,
I'm glad, you're voicing all your
yeah,
opinions that you have in your mind. Um, Something on the same lines, right? Another topic that you usually talk about, which is like, um, the kind of mistakes people usually
yeah.
do when they're applying for jobs, right? Especially as a designer. So probably something a little bit more on that as well.
I can talk about the mistakes I made. I can talk about I made a
Sure,
lot of
sure.
mistakes when applying to
Obviously.
jobs. And the one was most important was that the case studies, the projects I worked on were simply not relevant to the company and the work that they did, right? Especially when I was a student, I worked on a lot of like student projects, and a lot of student projects are very, very conceptual, right? Maybe they're not really going to work so well in the real world. They're not going to be practical, like, but you work on it to show your thought process. You work on it to show like how imaginative you are or what kind of solutions you can ideate or come up with, right? And most companies aren't going to be super interested in that. They're going to be like, how well can this guy fit in with our current team and our current practices and start, contributing as quickly as possible. And they see the portfolio as an evidence of that. So so that's the number one mistake I see, right? And so that translates into not having the experience of actually shipping something to completion. Like you just so like if you're a entry level person and you just have like redesigns of WhatsApp or redesigns of Spotify, right? Like sure, I'm sure that'll be great, but there's something very valuable you learn as a designer when you're like working with a developer. You keep running into technical constraints, you keep iterating, you keep tweaking your design on the fly based on what's possible or what's not possible, right? And once you've launched it, once it's actually in the hands of the consumer, like seeing how your design actually performs in real world basis, as opposed to what you assumed or what your assumptions were. And I think it's unfair to assume this from fresher designers, right? Like as a designer, I had no clue of this when I was applying to jobs straight out of college. But um but like if like right but now I think it's not so complex to ship side projects or find partners who people who partner with you, right? Or even these no code apps like Glide or Bubble to kind of translate your design intention into something that's even like partially working and talk about your learnings from doing that. Because like having shipped software, having a history or proven record of shipping software just makes you automatically more valuable to a company, right? That is one big mistake that I see people make, that they show portfolios of things that haven't shipped, or they show portfolios of things that, like, it's regardless of the process you follow, regardless of how sexy the visuals are, regardless of how novel whatever interaction it is you've come up with, like, if it's not there and being out there or being used by a user, like as a designer, then like you can't really claim it as work, honestly. And I know this is a bit of a hot take. And another mistake that people make is that, and I'll be very honest here, right? Is applying cold on the fucking LinkedIn or the job board. It's never worked for me. All the jobs I got have been either via me reaching out to like a decision maker or referral, or having been reached out to via recruiter. That's it. Like and companies will redirect you. They'll say that, oh no, don't contact me, go to our jobs board and apply. But like most of the time, like the HR, okay, so I'll give so something like Gojek gets about 400 applicants for every open design role, okay. Now, do you really think the HR is going to spend like the 10-20 minutes to go through your portfolio and think in detail? No. They're going to prioritize. And either they're going to prioritize based on some shitty heuristic. No, I'm not saying Gojek does this, but I know other companies do. They're going to prioritize based on some really shitty heuristic, like say the college you went to, or like the company you last worked at, right? So for example, if you're going to work at Google or Microsoft, like you're going to get a call back from every company you apply to. Or let's say, or the other heuristic they're going to use is referrals, right? So most companies generally assume that their employees know what kind of employees will be successful and refer good people. So like if you're going to apply by a referral, you're going to It's a much better way for you to get in front of an interview process than to apply cold via HR, via LinkedIn or whatever. That's the second biggest mistake I see people make. And but even while cold applying, right, like if they just say, hey, can you give me a referral, right? Like, why should I do that? Like, there is a way to reach out to people to ask for a favor. Like, I'm not gonna to say that, hey, I'm interested in this, I'd like to talk to you, learn more about the company. Like, instead of making it feel like you're demanding something from them, to make it feel like it's a two-way transaction, right? They're also getting value from you. So that's another big mistake I see people do. And the third big mistake I see is basically fluffing the portfolio presentation or case study, which is uh, so, like, you present your portfolio, right? You present your case study, but you so I think that one is to be very honest about the scope of work that you did. So, in obvious the scope of work I did, so for each particular project, I clearly called out that, hey, I worked with, there was a front end engineer, there's another senior designer on this. Here's the part I worked on. Here's what I did. Here's the impact of what I worked on. And otherwise, like, it's very easy to, especially when you're part of a team, right, to claim that, like, especially that something is completely about you, and then, like, when they ask you the question and they dig deeper, you're unable to answer, right? Like, just be honest about the scope of what you worked on and what you did. That's another big mistake that I see people do. And finally, I think that not tailoring the presentation to the needs of that company, right? For example, if you're a so if you're applying for like a UI design role, right? Like, they're not really going to care so much about all the user research and usability testing that you did. Of so like being a slightly sensible in terms of what they're looking for and what they're going to pay more attention to or value more highly, right? That's the that's the that's another mistake I see people make. And another thing you should realize is that the process is stochastic, like it's a crapshoot. Like, you can do everything right. You can, like, kick ass in the interview. You can have an awesome portfolio. You can get a referral from, like, from you can, like, and still not be selected for a bunch of reasons, right? And, like, it's important to, like, not take that personally. Like, when I was job searching, I applied to like 60 companies, right? Like you have to realize that that don't fixate on any particular company as a dream company and then be completely crushed when you don't end up getting it, right? That's another big mistake I see a lot of people make, that I will only work at Cred, I will only work at Google, and then just be like pissed off with themselves forever because they don't get it. And um
Yeah, I've made that mistake.
yeah, absolutely, I've made that mistake too. And or, like, you know what, you've put in a lot of effort you on the so, for example, there was a company I really wanted to work for, and I put in a lot of effort. I took like a week to prepare like this insane take home assignment, and they simply ghosted me. They didn't respond, and I was utterly pissed off about it. When I realized, like, that company is an asshole, and if they're going to do this to me, I'd have hated working there anyway, right? And I think, like, just the biggest mistake is taking rejection personally, as if it's a reflection of you as a person and your capabilities, right? It's not. Maybe those requirements didn't match at this particular time, right? Maybe they're looking for something you didn't have right now. That doesn't mean that you're worthless as a designer just because you got rejected by this company. And, like, if you're able to do that, I think then, and because of that, like, you just end up getting depressed, end up getting upset, and that affects your performance in, like, other interviews, right? Like, you're unable to think straight, you're just very sad, and, like, they and you're not able to, like, give your best in follow up interviews. So just having some level of and just have some level of cold bloodedness about the whole thing, that, hey, you know what, this is a transaction, it's an exchange. Right now this didn't work out, fine, doesn't matter, I'll figure something out later. That's, I think, the most important thing to do. Because uh so yeah, that's it on me. But to be fair, like, some places have, like, terrible and the other thing is not paying attention to red flags, right? So, for example, if you apply to some place and instead of an interview they just send you a take home assignment to do, then they'll consider you for an interview, right? Like, what the they're trying to get, like, free work out of you. What the hell is this, right? Just like paying attention to red flags, paying attention to to warning signals that this is not a good place to work for, or that my work will not be valued, and to exit that as quickly as possible. That's the final advice I'd have.
Great, man. So, yeah, some of these things are extremely important
Yeah,
stuff that like we tend to miss out sometimes when you're starting out, sometimes even after like, a couple of years of experience.
absolutely.
Um, yeah, I think you were point on with like a bunch of things that
Yeah,
we genuinely make as mistakes. I've made some of these mistakes as well.
yeah.
Um, but yeah, we have actually kind of reached the end of the episode.
Oh
Um,
wow,
I
so
mean,
quickly. Oh wow. Yeah.
yeah, and the way I usually end my episodes is like with a couple of rapid fire questions. So if you're ready, we can actually get started with it.
Yeah, let's go for it.
Awesome. Um, so the first question that I would ask is like, Um, probably like pick just one designer that you would like really, really admire and why.
Sure. Um, One of the designers I really admire a lot. His name is Anthony Hobday. He's an English. He's based in England, and he's a visual designer. And what he does is that he keeps writing books about visual design in the context of software and websites, and he tweets a lot about his work and about what works and doesn't work in certain trends in software and app design. And I really admire that because of the quality of his analysis. He's able to spot things, he's able to analyze and articulate things really well. And the time he spends creating this resource for people to like refer to and learn from. So that's what I really admire.
Awesome. Um, one piece of advice that you would give to young designers today.
I'd say that um, I would say that so there's a lot of bull that keeps getting spread about different kinds of companies, right? So like people say, I will never work at a services company. I will never work at like a TCS, Infosys, Wipro, right? Oftentimes, especially in downturns like this when startups are not hiring, these are the only companies that are hiring people. And despite all the bad things you hear about them, they have a lot of processes and set up in place that support your growth as a designer, right? So like a colleague of mine at Gojek, she was at then she joined a startup, right? And she was telling me that hey, recruiters would look down on her for working at but when she was there, she was working as part of a large design team. She got the chance to go on site a lot. She learned a lot of things, um, and they were like willing to hire her when like a lot of startups and all wouldn't, because she didn't have that pedigree, and she learned a lot from them, and she was able to use that as a springboard to move on to other places. So like, don't be too proud about where you're working. As long as there's mentorship, as long as there's a team, as long as there's guidance and people to learn from, that's that's just where you want to be.
Awesome. Um, my last question, and this is the question which I kind of ask
Yeah.
almost all my guests, which is like, if you literally had to like worry about nothing, whether it is like career, money, anything for that matter, um, what would you be doing right
Okay, you've just triggered an existential crisis in me. I think
now?
that I'm that kind of personality that I don't think I can ever retire, right? Like I can't just detach from work and say that I'm not going to work again. I'm going to need something to keep me busy, right? And I think I would probably, but if I don't have to worry about money, I think that I would probably work a lot more in the non-profit or charity sector, right? Um, they are getting completely screwed in this digital age. There are lots of non-profits and charities um, that are like struggling to like build their digital presence, create products, because a lot of the product talent doesn't want to work for them, right? And I think there's a lot of impact that can be had in helping out these organizations, and maybe that is what I would do.
Yeah, that's a great answer, man. Like, I actually haven't come across anyone telling that yet. I guess.
Yeah. No. I
But
volunteer
yeah,
sometimes for some charities and stuff in my
okay.
spare time, and I've seen it firsthand, right?
Mm,
So yeah, that's what
yeah,
I'd do.
yeah. I think that empathy and just knowing about the reality of things plays a huge role. Cool. I mean, just thank you so much for doing this episode. It was quite insightful,
Thank you.
and and I'm glad, like, you spoke your heart out, and, like, you were very honest
Yeah.
with, like, your thoughts and everything. Um, I'm 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 just grateful that we could finally do this episode. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Kaushik. I'm really glad that you invited me. I've been a big fan of this podcast. I can't wait for it to come out. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much for tuning in. Make sure you like, share, and subscribe to Product Stories for more such episodes.